So Diogenes syndrome, also known as senile squalor syndrome, is a disorder characterized by extreme self-neglect, domestic squalor, social withdrawal, apathy, compulsive hoarding of garbage or animals, and lack of shame. What's catatonia?
You sit there and stare at the wall and you...
Oh, really?
Recognize
Yeah, I would assume it has something to do with being in a catatonic
Well, I thought that was
state.
meditation, you know.
But
Sorry about that.
that's what all these hippies and yogis want you to think.
Yeah.
So that was fun. So Diogenes. Oh, yes, he lives in a barrel. Nobody said where the barrel came from. But look how old he lived. I bet he had Diogenes squalor syndrome. Yeah. Ancient philosophy, Western. So, the cynic. Yeah. So here's the word. You see it's koikos. Koinikos. Koinikos. However you would say that. Koinikos. So cynic, right? There's some interesting stories. One of my favorites is Alexander came up to him. Now, would that really have happened? I don't think so. But Alexander was supposed to have come up and heard that Diogenes, the great philosopher, was there. So he came over to say hello, and he stood there, looking down at him with the sun behind his back. He said to Diogenes, "I'm Alexander. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes looked up at him and said, "You could get out of my sun." And I think it was Ptolemy was with Alexander and said, "Oh, that's going to be the end of Diogenes." But instead, Alexander said, "If I were anyone besides Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." I don't know,
And then take over the world and not give one crap about the world.
But if you think, okay, what's the point of this? The idea is to have no care whatsoever, and I think you could talk about those individuals who want to be homeless. I mean, when they talk about the homeless problem, there's a percentage of folks that are homeless that want to be homeless because they don't want rent, they don't want an apartment, they don't want to have to get up and go to work. They don't want all the stuff that goes with the modern accoutrements of life, because they just want maybe to drink, maybe they're alcoholics, maybe not, maybe they're on other drugs, maybe they just want to be left alone. Who knows? So there are individuals apparently still, Seattle. I don't know if we have them here. I suppose we might. Although here you would think it's way too cold to just sit, in a barrel. Although I've come out of, pardon?
You'd think, and then you'd go downtown.
Yeah, exactly. There are people that sleep in the doorways of businesses there. They do other things in those doorways too, which is a shame and messy. But so that's one extreme philosophical position, and it doesn't go away. I mean that's a persistent feature that we have even today. I don't think it ever went away, actually. And there's some interesting things. A member of the Jesus Seminar, Robert Funk, in his book Honest to Jesus, I don't know if I mentioned it or not. Let me show you his. It's not a new book. It's been out I forget, for at least maybe 20 years or so. But he argues that John the Baptist was a cynic. Because when you look at the things we know about John the Baptist, if you remember, he would preach at the river. He would baptize people, right? But he just had like a bare shirt, whatever you call that, a rough, shirt that wasn't fine linen or anything, a staff and a sack where he carried a few things. So that's kind of like the cynic's uniform, right? The homeless dude's uniform, basically, right? Today, of course, it would be either a grocery cart or, a couple of bags or something. Cardboard sign or something, right? That kind of thing. So it's kind of a typical uniform that when you read about the cynics as a school of thinking, this was actually, he'd stand on a pillar, Diogenes would, during the day and preach, his philosophy, which I think is where in the movie The Life of Brian, they've got all these guys on pillars or, preaching in this one alley. I don't know if you remember that movie. Kind of the same sort of thing. And people would actually listen. Maybe some of the things that they said were kind of pithy, interesting. Remember, they didn't have educational opportunities for most people. But so John the Baptist, Robert Funk argues, was a cynic, which then, if the cynics are, notice you trace them back to Socrates, right? If that's the case, then John the Baptist is a cynic. He's a follower of Socrates. And, of course, Jesus comes to John and, in a sense, can be viewed as a follower of John. And, of course, when John ends up being imprisoned by Herod, and Jesus then basically takes up the job of being the preacher, you could argue that Jesus wears the same kind of uniform, that in that case, he argues that Jesus was a cynic philosopher. A lot of the biblical, the New Testament statements attributed to Jesus can be interpreted as cynic, philosophical teachings, etc. So that's kind of interesting. And if you write a response to the question, compare Socrates to Jesus, that could be one of the actually interesting things to mention, that some people think there is actually a philosophical connection between some of the things Jesus preached and Diogenes and Socrates. So interesting chain, but the answer, what they're arguing is an answer to the question, how should one live? And if you're following Aristotle, Aristotle tells us that the soul is the activity of the body. So the goal of life cannot be to go to heaven once the body is dead, because there is no part of you that continues on once the body dies, right? So your goal, your philosophical goal, the good life, right, has to be achieved while you are alive. In other words, you want to live so that you flourish, right? So Aristotelian philosophy, the virtue of flourishing is what you're after. So that's why he's so anxious to figure out what the word good means, right? How many different kinds of goods are there, and which of these goods are better than others, and why he, and in the end, ends up arguing that the kind of good that's best for us is not the kind where we're fighting over something that there's only a little bit of, but instead knowledge. Having knowledge is the best thing that gives us the good life. But for Aristotle, you have to have all the basics. You have to have that exact same thing that we get in the pyramid that we get from, who's the guy, the contemporary, Maslow, right? Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. If You think of, this, it's a more complex triangle or pyramid than Aristotle, because he's got extra things in here, but you still get the same idea. Plato and Aristotle still think, well, there's the basic bodily needs. You need a place to stay, you need clothing, you need food, you need all of that basic physical stuff. But above that, a more important need is the spiritual needs, right? And then even more than that is the kind of needs that are met by education, really, right? Self-actualization for Maslow, for Aristotle, it's basically wisdom, studying knowledge, and so on, right? So, of course, this is where we get the higher education concept, and the idea that a lot of educators point out that, the goal of your education is not so that you get a good job. Assuming you're going to have a job, most of it is the educated elite who already have enough wealth that, they're not looking for work, right? They've got the estate already, as long as they, keep their farmers occupied, et cetera, they're comfortable. So what should be the goal of a good life? Well, knowledge, that higher education, right? So they go to Oxford and drink. No, that's not what the goal should be, right? The goal should be, besides the drinking part of it, it should also be learning your Greek lessons, learning, science, philosophy, etc. Of course, all of that's gotten higher. But you can imagine that's the goal of this higher education, is self-actualization. Has nothing to do with learning a trade. That's down here, right? And that, obviously, in a country like ours, in a modern country today, where people are going to college to get an education so that they can get a good job, there's a serious cultural conflict there over what the whole point of an education is for. However, so for Aristotle, we've got to have all this stuff. You can't be expected to be a great philosopher, as in your 50s or whatever, in your community, and know a lot so that the young and others will come to you for wisdom. How do we do such and such? Unless, of course, you have all the other basics. Socrates is unusual that way. He's not wealthy, right? Plato was wealthy. Aristotle, never heard of him being poor at all in any respect. And Diogenes seems to be deliberately this way, because he doesn't want the care and concern associated with all of household things. No family. Never hear that Diogenes has family or anything. Some gross stories about him. He's suggests that everybody do whatever they feel like. So he used to masturbate in public. Sorry about that, but nonetheless, it's one of those grotesque sort of stories about him, because he's standing on a pillar in front of everyone. So, not sure how that would go over today downtown. Probably get arrested, I think.
Might be put in a straitjacket.
Boy, that would make that whole process much more difficult, wouldn't it? Okay, sorry about that. So the cynic, one extreme response to how to have a happy life, right? The next one, though, lot more complex. Epicurus. Epicurus, as a philosophy, stole the name himself. It became Epicurean. So if you follow Epicurus, the title of that philosophy is Epicurean. And if anything, have you probably heard this associated with restaurants at all? Did you ever hear of a restaurant as being Epicurean? Yes? No? What do you think? Do they have something on the web? Recipes, Epicurean recipes, restaurant. So what's funny about this is all of this is exactly what Epicurus thought was bad. Epicurus taught that you should eat simple foods and a lot of no shellfish. There were a couple of philosophers that thought beans were bad for some reason. Eat no beans.
It would be
Why?
the tooth factor.
That might be our first thought. So Pythagoras is one. But I've heard Epicurus said the same thing. And what I've heard is that they oddly thought that beans looked like a fetus. So they were concerned that eating beans were somehow kind of like eating humans. So no beans, they thought that was kind of evil. They also thought you shouldn't eat shellfish. Now, the reason for that is a very practical matter. People could die from bad shellfish or bad food. So the goal for Epicurus is to lead the long, healthy life, right? So eat foods that are sensible foods, that are good for you, right? Instead of eating weird things, like going to fancy restaurants where they have very spicy, crazy foods that you've never eaten before. That's just the opposite of the good, solid advice of eating, like oatmeal, corn. Well, I don't know that they had corn, but I'm sure they had other grains and things of that sort. Not necessarily vegetarian foods. I believe meats were fine for them, but not shellfish. Seafood, certainly fine. But you get the idea. It's a healthy diet, the kind that will not make your stomach upset, which, by the way, is why it's odd that he ended up dying of a disorder and eating. Something got him. Here it is here. What killed him? Say? Oh,
Kidney
okay, so
stones.
kidney stones. Sounds pretty miserable. And do you get kidney stones because of your diet? It could be also a genetic predisposition to it, and he was old, pretty old, so I don't know. I think one of my funniest stories is of a friend of mine who was on a cruise in Moscow, on one of the river cruises, and while he was in Moscow, he ended up with severe pain. It turned out, of course, to be a kidney stone. But he didn't know that at the time. So here he is, English speaking, not Russian speaking, in Moscow, and he had the pain. So they took him by ambulance from the cruise ship to a hospital, where of course no one could speak English. And while he was there and they were doing all sorts of tests on him, And he remembered that, you know, there ended up blood from him all over the floor, and the woman came in with one of those sponge mops to clean it up. You know? Right. But at the one point where he was going to the bathroom, he heard clink, and he felt better. And so he knew that that's what that was, that it was a kidney stone, and he knew it was gone and that he was okay. And they wouldn't let him go until he ended up being processed out to another hospital where he went. They had to pay. It was something like $10,000 for the night or whatever. And then he was finally released that he could go back to the cruise ship. So it was a very expensive, no insurance kind of covered it kind of thing. It was a cash-only deal. You imagine? And the other part of that was his wife, when she left the hospital that night, leaving him there, you know, by himself, you know, and she had to get back to the cruise ship. They put her in a cab, and the cab driver didn't speak English, so she was totally stuck trying to figure out how to tell the cab driver where the heck she was supposed to go. So don't end up with kidney stones in Russia. That's, you know, painful from what I understand. But so Epicurus, as a philosophy, he's trying to avoid stress, but instead of completely not being interested in having a good life, in the sense that Diogenes just wants to lead the dog life, right? Epicurus believes in having a garden, living in a garden. So I think, in a practical sense, people that want to live like out in the bush and have their own cabin, raise their own food, hunt, raise their family out away from city life, you know, so they don't have all the stresses of crime and pollution, although, you know, we don't have that much pollution here, but, you know, if you've ever been to any of the major metropolis areas, Anchorage doesn't even rate as a city in the national sense, because you have to have at least 1 million people for it to be a city. So we're rural. Our biggest city is rural by comparison. But if you've ever been in that, it's just stressful just the minute you kind of like arrive, because you just feel all this stress. And you can have exactly that kind of thing. Rome was like that. I think if I can... Interesting.
In this case, I imagine died in that great battle. I suspect I might be the first person to put this helmet on. Whereas the average ancient city liked to imagine that its original inhabitants had sprung miraculously from the soil of the homeland, the Romans imagined that their city had originally been a city of asylum seekers. It was an attempt to give a mythic dimension to one of Rome's later most distinctive characteristics, that it not only welcomed outsiders, but that eventually it spread Roman citizenship throughout the empire.
She's one of my favorites, by the way.
The city had no
I
women,
especially think her
and
sneakers
therefore
are sexy.
The city had no future. But none of the people in the neighbouring towns were prepared to give their
Wait till you
daughters
see her
to be
sneakers.
Roman wives. They were actually nastily insulting and made no secret of the fact that they didn't think a band of runaways was great husband material. So Romulus had to resort to a trick. So the story goes, Romulus invited his neighbours, the Sabines, to a religious festival. In the middle of the proceedings, he gave a signal for his men to abduct all the young women among the visitors and to carry them off as their wives. This is the famous rape of the Sabine women, and it's an almost uncomfortably frank image. This woman here has been captured and she's trying to get away, but she's not going to make it. This one has already collapsed. And another is trying to flee, but it's hopeless. The rape might have been a response to a terrible Roman humiliation, but it was still a violent assault. These women are not willing, they're victims. It's an incident that the Romans discussed and debated and displayed ever after. Some of Rome's enemies said that this was absolutely typical Roman behaviour. If they wanted something, they just went out and grabbed it. In the story, the families of the Sabine women, as you'd expect, hit back at the Romans in what would be Rome's first war and first victory,
Aren't they sexy?
which was commemorated in a rather strange monument at the heart of
She's
the city.
famous for them, by the way.
Most people walk straight past here, but it's where the Romans were convinced that the heart of that battle took place, in what became the Forum, but what was then not much more than a swamp. And they marked the spot where one of Rome's first enemies fell to his death. This was just one of a series of monuments that imprinted the origins of Rome onto the face of the latest city. If you wanted, you could go up to the Palatine Hill and see what was supposed to be the hut of Romulus himself, still a tourist attraction in the 4th century AD. The myths of Rome were there for all to see, and with them the problems of being Roman: fratricide, rape, violence, and constant conflict.
Good music, too.
Rome at the beginning was ruled by kings, Romulus and 6 others to follow. But the citizens eventually rejected what they'd come to see as a tyranny and established a kind of democracy in which every year the people elected officials to govern the city and fight its wars. And soon after that, there were signs that Rome was beginning to grow. Why is it that an ordinary little town by the Tiber became something much, much bigger than that? The honest truth is, we don't know why it happened, but we do know when. We can almost touch it, almost. Because in the early 4th century BC, the Romans built this massive city wall around their town. Now, there's more to this than just defence. This is a big statement that Rome has arrived. And even more interesting, a lot of the stone they used to build it came from the territory of a little town a few miles up the road that they'd just taken over. This is one of the first hints of Roman expansion. Rome's growth didn't stop at its walls. It expanded beyond them, deep into the Italian peninsula.
Mary Beard.
We'll talk about her more later, because she's the one that debates Boris. That's one of the opportunities to try to decide which Greece or Rome have had more impact on modern culture. Both, of course, but which one do you think might have had more impact on us? Fantastic debate, by the way, between the two of them. And Boris, by the way, reminds me a lot like Donald Trump, except Boris is educated in a different way than Donald Trump.
Student
You know.
and an A student.
Well, I mean, if you didn't I play a little bit of this already? In one of the, earlier classes? Yes? No?
Maybe.
Welcome all to what is going to be an extraordinary evening. We've all played those kind of parlour games, something versus something. In the Mar family on our way to primary school, it'd be Prokofiev or Shostakovich, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. Well, this is the simplistic version, Greece versus Rome. Now, I have to say, for those who may not have attended very carefully to the publicity ahead of time, I should emphasise this is ancient Rome versus classical Greece, which is in many ways a bit of a disappointment to me, because I was looking forward to Mary Beard speaking out for Berlusconi and Boris here making the case for Syriza. I sincerely hope there are many Greeks and Italians in the audience. Put your hands up if there's any Greeks or Italians in the audience. Just a few. What I really want to know is whether you change your minds and go for the other guys halfway through this debate. These things depend upon intellectual fireworks, and we have two kind of arsenals of intellectual fireworks here. We have Oxford and Cambridge. We have two great authors who produce many, many books, and